Hello, everyone. Welcome to BSC 2085, which is Human Anatomy and Physiology Part 1. In our very first chapter, we're going to do a quick orientation, talk about what to expect in an A&P course. We're also going to talk about some important concepts like homeostasis, feedback mechanisms, and we're going to take a look at some body orientation terminology as well as planes so that we can properly prepare to be successful in this. Now let's start with what exactly anatomy and physiology mean. Whenever you hear about anatomy, you often will study the structure of a particular item, whether it is a cell or a tissue or an organ that you're looking at. And you also want to take a look at how they're able to connect to each other or work together. So anatomy will all be about the appearance of the item. Physiology will focus on the function. How do we get it to propel? How do we get it to contract? How do we get it to secrete? What is its overall contribution that it's doing for the body? How does it carry out these life-sustaining activities? And this class combines the form and the function in the overall A&P, or anatomy and physiology. Now, when you discuss anatomy as well as physiology, as you can imagine, there are a lot of topics to cover. So at times, we're going to have to focus on what we call gross anatomy or microscopic anatomy or developmental anatomy. It really depends on which particular body type or cell type you're looking at. Gross anatomy, also known as macroscopic anatomy, is going to take a look at very large visible structures. So items that you can easily see with the naked eye. And you can do this as a regional sense, meaning that you just focus on the upper body or the lower body or the thoracic region or the abdomen region. Oftentimes in our book, for instance, they will do what they call system anatomy, which is that you correlate and take a look at body systems. So for instance, how does your muscular system work? How does your digestive system work? Your reproductive system? What are the organs that are involved? What are the tissues that are involved? How does it contribute to the overall well-being or homeostasis of the body? When we do things like muscles, we can also take a look at surface anatomy, which is that we're looking at internal structures that can be laid on by a top layer versus a bottom layer. So for instance, you can have what we like to call our superficial muscles, which are the muscles that are directly below the skin. And then we also have deep muscles. That will usually indicate that you have a second or a third layer of muscle that you would have to peel through in order to examine it. On a smaller scale, you can have microscopic anatomy, which will take a look at things like cytology and histology. In our case, we're going to do a whole chapter on histology, which is the microscopic study of tissues. So how does a muscle tissue look like under the microscope? What are some unique characteristics of an epithelium tissue or of a connective tissue? And in our class, not so much, but in many A&P classes towards the tail end, they tend to do some developmental anatomy, which will take a look at the development of throughout the life, whether we start at the embryonic stage and how the organism will grow and develop. We briefly talk about it in 2085, but we really do more of it in our second section of this class, which will be BSc 2086. But overall, what you want to keep in mind is that if you want to focus on anatomy, your concept needs to be on the overall structure and shape of the entity. And most of the time, that can be done by obviously observing different imagery or looking at different slides, but also the actual essence of being able to manipulate and palpate or osculate or listen to the structure as it's doing its day-to-day function. When you take a look theology and your focus is on functioning and basic responses, then of course we can also do a subdivision again. And just like when we had our anatomy description, we can start off on a larger scale by taking a look at organ systems and then kind of narrow it down to how the tissues contribute, how the cells contribute. Oftentimes with physiology, it's very important to understand what they call basic principles. So what is a pressure gradient? what is a concentration gradient? How can a cell have a resting membrane potential? So we'll talk a lot about in our class, since we are the first part of the ANP. We'll talk a lot of things about basic energy and chemical properties. We'll do a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of action potentials. We'll take a look at things like movement down a concentration gradient when you have like diffusion or osmosis. And once you have a better understanding of these basic physical principles, it'll make sense on a larger scale how the cell can then work together in a tissue format and in an organ format to overall give the physiology of that particular section of the body that you would like to learn more about. Our body is extremely complex. It is a really nice example of what we like to call an emergent property, which is that it starts out very simple and it builds upon itself. And as the item becomes larger and more complex, we often will get a greater benefit out of the entity than the individual pieces are able to contribute. So the sum is greater than the individual parts, right? So the human body, when you break it down, we can break it down into organ systems, into tissue types, into cell types, even in the chemical level. And part of what our class will explore is different aspects of this hierarchical structure, starting off from the simplistic cell all the way to how the tissues are formed and then morph into the organs and the organ systems. So if we look at the image that we have on figure 1.1, we see that the human body is just on the organism level, it's just a compilation of smaller parts, such as the body systems, the organs, the tissues that come into play. And in fact, in one of our following chapters, we're going to spend some time and take a look at the cell, the fundamental unit of life, and what are some of the organelles that we find in there, things like the mitochondria, the nucleus, the rough and the smooth ER, and how did they contribute to the overall functioning of the cell, and how the cells can then link together to form tissues, and of course, tissues form organs and build from there and have that emergent property. The sum is greater than the individual parts. As we continue our introduction, chapter 1, it's going to go ahead and bring up some things to keep in mind. So, for instance, in order for us to have a healthy, functioning body, there are certain maintenance and necessities that are important. For instance, things like maintaining boundaries. And this can be as small as taking a look at a cell and seeing that the cell has a cell membrane that allows to have a separation between intra and extracellular components, or we can take a look at it as large as that the integumentary system, which contains our skin, our largest organ, is an excellent way that we can separate external and internal conditions for ourselves. In order for life to be sustained, we need to have movement, and movement, of course, in the sense of walking and running, but also internally and using your GI tract to move your food from the mouth down to the stomach, the small, large intestines. Also, movement within the bloodstream so that we can transport our red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. We need items like responsiveness. This is, for instance, when we have the correlation or the combination of our sensory system and our nervous system being able to retrieve stimulus and then processing it to figure out if, for instance, our body needs to move or stay. Or best example that I can think of right now is your reflex. You put your hand on something hot, and before you even know it, you've pulled it away. And that's all because we're responding to the stimuli that it might be harmful to be near such a hot surface. Digestion will take a look at things like hydrolysis of our food to get down to the nutrient level. In order for something to be successful and alive, oftentimes we discuss the fact that it requires energy, energy in the sense from the nutrients that we can get from our food, where we can extract that energy and convert it into ATP molecules, courtesy of the mitochondria. Metabolism and excretion, they kind of go and take a look at things like how do we then utilize this energy to build items, or how can we pull stuff apart to extract the energy that we find within the chemical bonds. So we'll talk about dehydration and hydrolysis synthesis. And whatever entity your body cannot use, it will need to figure out a way to excrete it. So the formation of fecal matter, which is undigestible food that we need to then relieve out of our system, or the urination process, which is a way that we can excrete toxins, um, excuse me, or waste products, or sweating. Those are all examples of excretion. Reproduction and growth, those are obviously necessary for not only the development of the human body, but also to leave a secondary or tertiary generation so that we can see how we will continue to adapt and evolve as we interact with our continuous environment. Altogether, humans are obviously multicellular. We are eukaryotic cells, which means that we house a nucleus. And as these cells start working together, we see that it will eventually give rise to our different organ systems. Now, there are 11 organ systems altogether within us. We're looking at things like the integumentary system, which is like the skin and all the accessories like nails and hair, skeletal system, your bones, the muscular system, your muscles, nervous system with the brain and the nerves and the spinal cord, endocrine system, which is mostly your hormones, cardiovascular system, which takes a look at your heart and your blood vessels, urinary system, kidneys and urine formate excretion, reproductive system, the lymphatic system, which is all about lymphatic drainage and working together with your immune system. And then, of course, finishing it off with the respiratory system, thinking about the lungs, and our digestive system, which, of course, will highlight the use of things like our stomach, our small intestines, our large intestines, and accessory organs like liver, pancreas, and spleen. Here is a beautiful illustration of the organ systems having a cohesive, or I should say, a collaborative type of relationship. And you could see as it outlines, and I don't know if you noticed this about the figure, the outline of the figure is meant to represent your skins. That's the integumentary system that forms the boundary that protects the body from external intruders. And then inside, internally, you could see that through the use of orifices openings, we then gain access to our tract, our digestive system. Here's our respiratory system. And as they correspond, the nutrients and the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are able to travel within the bloodstream, through which our heart plays the role of pump, propelling the blood throughout the body so that the nutrients can be dispersed, the oxygen can be dropped off, and of course, the carbon dioxide and waste products can be collected. These waste products can then be expelled through our kidneys as part of our urinary system as one of the ways to eliminate them out of our body. So it truly is a collaborative action that we are looking at. Here are some things or some factors that we would need in appropriate amounts for humans to be able to survive. So these are things like nutritional demands, where we take a look at the different chemical substances that we need for energy and cell building. So this would be things like utilizing carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. Oxygen use is, of course, very important because we are aerobic respirators, which means that we require oxygen in order to maximize the amount of ATP that the mitochondria can generate from our food sources. Water is necessary for part of our homeostasis, as well as plays a role in different energy components, such as hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis. Body temperature is another important aspect because our cells thrive at a specific temperature. For humans, we're looking at around 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That is our optimal body temperature that we're aiming for. And of course, different atmospheric pressures. Atmospheric pressures are important in many aspects. but the main goal for them is to control the amount of oxygen flowing into the body and carbon dioxide being expelled from the body. This then leads us to a really important discussion, which is homeostasis. So the term homeostasis you'll see consistently throughout the different chapters, and it's important to understand that homeostasis by definition means that there is a relative stable internal condition or set point that you're trying to reach. Homeostasis for humans often centers around internal body temperature or internal pH. For us, we're going to start off with the temperature. So as I said to you before, our internal body temperature that we like to aim for is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we see happening is that your body has different systems set up that will either short term or long term help us regulate and maintain that temperature, regardless of the internal and external factors that we are exposed to. It is important to point out that homeostasis does allow for small amount of fluctuations as long as you average back around the set point or the setting that you are looking for that is important for the cell health and maintenance. Let me go ahead and show you a demonstration right here. So here's an interaction where you have your set point that you're trying to have, and you can have slight bit of fluctuations, and it's all depending on three areas within the homeostatic balance. You have what we call the receptor, and the receptor is able to detect any type of stimulus that might potentially cause a change in variation. So let's go ahead and continue our example of body temperature, right? So our internal body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, it faces some challenges, especially when we take our body and we put it in environments that are either hot or cold. And the receptors that we have, whether we're looking at our skin receptors or we're looking at our sensory system, they are able to detect these changes. So for instance, let's say this morning when you got up, when you went outside, you noticed that it was a lot colder than it normally is. The coldness will be detected by the receptor, and it will then go ahead and send that information to the control center. And the control center is usually when we take a look at our nervous system. They are able to receive the signals from the afferent pathway, and the control center will then pick up on the fact that it's colder than normal, and we want to make sure that we preserve the body heat that we have so that we don't start freezing from the inside, right? And what we see happening is once the control center has detected that there is an action that can be done, it will send it over to the effector, and the effector will cause the response that is needed to restore us back to the set point. In this case, when you walked outside and it was really cold, your body detected that, and what you'll notice is that you're going to start shivering. The shivering is the response. It is this involuntary muscle contraction that is meant to generate body heat so that it warms you as you expose your body to the colder elements. And if you're not into cold, that's perfectly fine. Think about any time you walk out somewhere where it's really hot. First thing you're going to notice is that you start sweating, and that is because the effector or the response was to have a cooling mechanism, which is what sweat is meant to be, thereby restoring you back to the balance. I would once again like to highlight the fact that with homeostasis, you are able to fluctuate ever so little as long as you average back out. So in my class, I always tell my students if we were to take each other's temperature, many of us would not be at 98.6 directly. We might be a little bit off, 99, 97, but what we would see is if we take our temperature every hour for the entire day, at the end of it, we would average back out very close to the set point that we're looking for. Now, in order in our homeostasis, your body will tend to use feedback systems to regulate the response to the stimuli. So you have what we call a negative feedback system, and we have a positive feedback system. The negative feedback system is by far the most used mechanism in the body. It is based on the fact that once the stimulus is detected, the response will be sent out. And as the response comes out, the stimulus goes away. So I like to think of it as kind of like supply and demand. As soon as the body responds, the stimulus shuts down so that there's no need for the response to continue beyond its primary issue that needed to be done. A really good example of that is when you take a look at your house. And if you have central AC, then you have a little thermostat that controls the overall temperature. And, let's say you went out, you enjoyed your day, and it was a little hotter than normal. So when you came back into your house, you wanted to have that nice little cool breeze. So you wanted the AC to pump just a little bit more. So what you would do is you would walk over to the thermostat and you would lower that temperature that the setting is on. Like perhaps maybe you normally like it at 77 degrees. Well, you want it a little bit colder, so we lowered it to 74. Well, what's happening is that you're sending a stimulus. You would like it to be colder. And what's going to happen is that your AC unit is going to detect that stimulus and it's going to start pumping cold air. And as the AC turns on and it starts pumping cold air, it will continue to do that until it reaches 74 degrees, because that's what you want. And once you reach that temperature, the AC will shut off. Why? Well, one, we don't want it to be any colder. And two, we don't want to buy or pay for additional energy to keep it running. So what we see here is that there was a stimulus, the work was done, and once the result was achieved, the stimulus went away. So this would then be an example of a negative feedback system. Here is an illustration, and then we can kind of talk about this as how your negative feedback system comes into play. So you can see that our goal is to have our overall internal temperature control. And what we see happening is that we have two stimulus. We have one scenario where it is hot, and then we have another scenario where it is too cold. And in both instances, what we see is that the receptor is able to detect the temperature changes and communicates that with the control center. And it will go ahead and send down the effector pathway a proper response. So when it was too hot, we see that we start to sweat because that's our cooling mechanism. And as it starts to sweat, it will restore the balance and the stimulus gets shut down and we're back to normal. If it's too cold, then what we see is that the effector will cause us to shiver. And once again, we see that the balance is restored, so the stimulus will get shut down. Your body can do this on a short-term and a long-term analysis. So sweating and shivering are example of short-term analysis. On the longer term, it will usually involve things like hormonal changes. Like for instance, your thyroid hormone has a metabolic or a calorogenic effect, which means that it helps us break down our food, but in doing so, it also helps us generate body heat. So if we decide that we're going to go somewhere where it's a lot colder than normal and we're going to stay there for a few more days, we won't be shivering the whole time. Instead, what your body will do is will go ahead and it will stimulate the nervous system to communicate with the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And this hormone will travel to the thyroid where it will cause the release of thyroid hormone. As the thyroid hormone is released, it generates more body heat because once again, it's a calorogenic effect. So it's going to cause you to get hungrier. And as you're eating more, you're burning the calories, you're generating more heat. And as the heat is being generated, the stimulus that came from the nervous system that was stimulating the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, that stimulus gets shut down because it's a negative feedback system. So in a negative feedback system, the stimulus is sent out, the body starts to respond to it, and as soon as it gets the results that it desires, it shuts down the stimulus. So you really only work up until you get your result, and then you make the stimulus go away, and it restores the balance of whatever homeostatic pathway you were looking at. So supply and demand, that's how I like to think of it. Wherever there's a negative, there also needs to be a positive, right? So in a positive feedback system, what we see is that we have an amplification route that we're going to go about. So in a positive feedback system, what we see is that you once again have a stimulus that will detect a change. You will start working on a response, but instead of the response causing the stimulus to go away, like we see in a negative feedback system, we see that the response will actually amplify the stimulus, which will cause a higher degree of response to go. So it's a self-amplification pattern that we're looking at, or a cascading effect, as some of you might know. Positive feedback systems take a lot of energy because it keeps going and going and going and amplifying and cascading. So we'll see that it will often be caused in life-altering or life-saving situations. Probably the two best examples are the one that the book likes to use, which is labor for birthing processing, and of course, blood clotting. Let's talk about blood clotting first. So here you have an example where you have a break in the blood vessel. And as you can see, the blood is starting to leak out, which we definitely don't want. So what happens is that there are messengers that are sent, and the stimulus is sent out to please come and repair the cut. So what we see happening is that platelets will quickly be attracted and adhere to the site of injury. Now, think about this. If this was a negative feedback system, that would mean that the minute that one platelet shows up, and remember, platelets can clot or coagulate, seal up that hole. When one platelet shows up, then the stimulus would go away. That would be a negative feedback, right? One platelet is not enough to repair the damage on the wall. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to do a positive feedback system. And a positive feedback system says that once you get that first platelet to show up, it's going to amplify the stimulus to recruit a second platelet, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and it just keeps going. And we see this amplification of response as more and more platelets start to adhere to the surface. And eventually you have a massive amount of platelets, which will then clump together and release fibrin, which is enough to clog up the hole from the leaking blood vessel. The other example is childbirth. So when it's time for the baby to be born, if all goes well, what we see is that the baby will rotate so that the head will be at the bottom of the uterus and the head will ever so lightly knock, knock, knock. And as it's knocking on the uterus walls of mom, it sends a signal to the brain and the brain releases oxytocin. And oxytocin then travels down to the uterine and causes a contraction. The problem is that one contraction is not enough to get the baby out. So we can't have a negative feedback. Instead, we're going to do a positive feedback, which says that the minute you get that first contraction, it's going to cause even more oxytocin to be released, which then causes you to have a second contraction. Even more oxytocin is released. Now you get a third, a fourth, a fifth. This is one of the reasons why when we take a look at childbirth and we take a look at the contractions usually start really far apart. And then as the labor continues, the contractions get closer and closer and stronger because they keep being amplified by the amount of oxytocin that is continuously being released within the system, causing the contractions to eventually open the cervix up to about 10 centimeters, which is enough room for the baby's head to squeeze on through and enter through the birth canal. Once the baby is ejected, what we see happening is that the contractions start to lessen because the oxytocin is not released anymore as often as it was initially, and the positive feedback system will then stop. And then a cool fact is that the oxytocin that stays within your body still continues to float around and is then utilized for skin to skin bonding, making an emotional bond with the child. And this doesn't only happen with the birth mom, it can also happen with the father, or if there's a case of surrogacy, the parents to which the child will go home with. Anytime there's skin to skin contact, your body will release oxytocin, which will allow you to have an emotional bond. I remember reading an article that said that if you have a dog, whenever the dog gets super happy to see you when you come home, the dog will actually release oxytocin as well. It is the same sensation we get when we look at someone that we love, or if you have a cute little crush, that's feeling of being in love, that is all due to oxytocin, aka the cuddle or love hormone. All right, everyone, I'm going to stop chapter 1, part 1 over here right now. And when we pick up, we're going to take a look at the end part of the chapter, which is going to take a look at anatomical terminology. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact me. All right, we'll talk soon. Bye.